Hello and welcome back. In the previous video we've added Materialize to the site, and now we're ready to start working on the chatbot. In this video we'll prepare chatbot component. In React we have functional components and we have class components. The main reason to use a class component is because we can keep track of the state of the component. We cannot keep track of the state in the functional component. And the other reason is that the class component can have methods like, for example, component will mount and component did mount, which are a part of the life cycle of a component. So these are like hooks, methods that can run at some point of component rendering or mounting, if you will, or at removing of the component, that is unmounting. This mounting and unmounting or showing and removing a component is called life cycle of a component. And with class component we can hook at particular time of that process, which is great. The downside of using the class component is that they are hard to test because of the state. It's hard to write tests when component's behavior is dependent on its state. That makes testing much harder. Why am I telling you all this? Well, we need to somehow remember if the chatbot window is opened, we need to remember what messages have been passed between user and a bot. And for this, we need to have state. And yes, the other way to go would be using Redux. We could write these two states to Redux store. And I did think about it quite a long time before I created this course. And I've just decided that Redux would be an overcomplication at this part. Redux is great when you have some piece of application state that needs to be mapped to multiple components. In our case, only chatbot component needs to know the messages and if chatbot window is opened or not. Also, Redux is great when you have many properties that are being passed through hierarchies of components. And we don't. We just have a chatbot component that is communicating with backend and no other component. That is why I decided to create a class component that will be storing messages in states and showing them to the user. So again, functional components cannot have states. They cannot have methods, and we need to store all messages and other states of chatbot component. That is why we're using a class component. Using Redux would be an overhead in this case. Now enough with the talking. Let's get started. Go to code, to chatbot component. To create a class component, we need to import component from React. We do this by adding a comma and curly braces with component to the import statement. Why the difference, you ask? Why don't we just write component without the curly braces? Well, this difference is the way they are exported in the module. React is exported as export default, and component is exported only as export. The first one is called default export and the second one named export. In a module you can only have one default export and many named exports. The difference is in importing. As you see, named exports need to be imported with curly braces. If you'd like to read more about it, search for named and default exports in ES modules, okay? Let's move on. We need to change these components to class component. Syntax for writing a class component is class, chatbot, extends, component. Like this. And now, because this is now a class component, we need to wrap this return into a render method. Class component will always render content in a render method. So render is a method and it needs to return JSX code. Return. Like this. Let's change this code a bit. First I'll add a wrapper around the chatbot, a div. Now I'll add some styles to this div. I'll make it 400 high, so height will be 400. And I'll also add width, also 400. And let's position it right, therefore float right, like this. Inside this div, I'll create a div where all the messages will be displayed, and this div will have an ID chatbot. Let's apply some style to it. It must be 100% height, and width will also be 100%. And I'll add a scroll. When there are more messages, we'll need a scroll to see them all. That's why we add overflow auto. Okay, so here all the messages will go. Add a header, H2, chatbot. And down here, below the header, we'll display messages. That is the conversation. Great, now we are on the way to create a chatbot. What we're missing right now is the input from the user. User needs to communicate to the bot. That's why under all messages we will add input. Type is text. And woohoo, now open the page. If your server is not running, you need to go first to terminal, to project folder, and write npm start deo. And this is the start of our chatbot interface. We're not halfway there yet, but it's a start. Okay, we've said that we'll be using class components because it can have states. So let's add state to this component. And at the beginning, chatbot will have no messages, okay? But where do we set initial state? Well, in the constructor. So add a constructor to the component and pass props to it. Prop stands for properties. We'll pass this to parent component by writing super props. Like this. And now we can set state. State is a property of component. This state is an object. Messages, an empty array. Messages are an array, so we'll have an array of messages, but they'll be empty at the beginning of conversation. So great. In this video, you've changed the chatbot component from functional to class component. As such, the component can now have methods and properties. The most important property being state. In the state of the chatbot component will store messages and other information about the bot. The next thing we need to add to the bot is communication with the backend. And that's what we'll do in the next video. See you soon. Bye bye.